All right, welcome back to Researching Happy. This is episode 41. In an episode we're calling New Year, Same Me. So, really, what we're talking about is New Year's resolutions, habit formation, and lots of the traps that we fall into. And we're really fortunate to have Dr. Naomi Kakoschke from CSIRO come and talk to us about all the things health and well-being that she sees from her research and from around. So, Merry Christmas, Happy New Year. We've got some really exciting things just in the background of the podcast. So, a couple of things just to cover off before we get into the episode. The first is that we have a new home on YouTube, which is at the Be Well Co. So, Be Well Co is a place that I've worked for a number of years now, and they've got a large YouTube channel basically, which will be the home for this show going forward. So do me a favor and do yourself a favor and go and subscribe there on YouTube. Be space well space co. I'll put a link and you should hopefully find it. In terms of the episodes going forward, we've got a bit of a debate in the works that we're looking to set up. So if you've been following along on LinkedIn, we talked about the fact the last episode was about, why is positive psychology like the UFC? This idea that we've got all these different methodologies and approaches that kind of meld together, but there's not this space for them to actually spar. Basically, like you would find in wrestling, you find in UFC, you find really quickly, if all you can do is punch and then you meet a wrestler, the punching doesn't really work that well. And so we want to potentially become the place where we can have some of these debates. It won't be physical, hopefully, but that's in the work. So I think that's going to be something exciting that I'd like to see a bit more of in the future. I'm going to be in the US in February. I've been invited to present a keynote at the SPSP conference in Denver. So that's really exciting. And, welcome any recommendations for Colorado. Not that I'll be there for very long with 3 kids at home. And, I'm kind of pushing my luck there. But let me see. What else have we got? That's everything from my updates. So like I say, today's episode is about sort of habit formation, New Year's resolutions. And Naomi takes us through some really interesting things that I hadn't really heard when it comes to habit formation. Mostly, like is often the case, just the sort of the automatic traps that we fall into, particularly with habit formation. So things like being too ambitious, relying on motivation, which obviously fluctuates rather than being consistent. This idea of sort of habit stock take, so just actually taking a step back and looking at what works, what doesn't in your life. We talk about sort of the power of will versus your capacity and what's around you. And not that, I don't know whether we named it exactly, but the importance of examination. You'll hear from Naomi. So much of this is about actually examining your life, your habits, what works for you. And so I think we can all set some very achievable goals, as you'll hear, things that are achievable, small goals to actually set these into our lives. So like I say, subscribe on YouTube, the Be Well Co YouTube. Subscribe to the Researching Happy Spotify channel and find me on LinkedIn, because a lot of this conversation is really kicking off, particularly this stuff about debates, which I think I'm really excited about. And finally, you can have a look on researchinghappy.com and join the mailing list to keep on top of all of these things that are happening soon. So thanks. And enjoy the episode. As always, let me know what you think and share this episode with someone that you think will benefit from it. Thanks. I don't know where my head's at. I made a coffee before this and I don't even know where I put it. I think I didn't drink it, but
do you want to look for it?
That's okay. We'll just get started. This can be the start. So, welcome to Researching Happy. We have with us Dr. Naomi Kakoschke, who is a research scientist from CSIRO with a focus on advancing knowledge in health behavior change. She has expertise in the psychological processes underpinning health behaviors, with a particular focus on dietary intake, where she's made significant contributions to identifying and modifying the cognitive drivers of unhealthy eating habits. So it is January the 2nd. Most New Year resolutions have already failed. So this is perfect timing to have Naomi come and talk to us. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much for having me here today, Matt.
Yeah, no problem. So quickly tell us about yourself and where you've been, what you've been up to, and what you do at CSI.
Yeah, sure. So I've been based at CSIRO for almost 5 years now. I work as a senior research scientist in the behavioral science space, but I'll go a little bit into my background. So my background's in psychology. I've done an undergraduate degree and PhD in psychology. I've mostly focused on this intersection between cognitive psychology and health psychology, and specifically in the area of eating behavior. My main motivation, I guess, around that is that when it comes to things like eating, but other health behaviors as well, we have a lot of explicit knowledge or education often about these behaviors and what we should be doing, but so many of us aren't as healthy as we would like to be despite having this knowledge. So are there other drivers and perhaps things that we're not quite so aware of at a psychological level that might lead us to, not always sticking with our health goals, or our behaviours not always aligning with our goals or intentions? So I've worked a lot in the behaviour change space, trying to work out what these factors are to begin with, and then importantly, trying to develop interventions that people can use on a daily basis to try and help overcome some of these sort of psychological biases that can help them live healthier lives and engage in healthier behaviours. So I've worked at Flinders University, so I did my PhD, and then worked at Monash University in Melbourne as a postdoc. Here I also worked in the brain imaging space, so also looking at the cognitive neuroscience. So actually looking at what's happening, which parts of the brain are lighting up when people make these decisions to, say, go for the unhealthier food option over a healthy option when they're presented with a couple of choices. So some classic things around, a chocolate milkshake versus a green juice or something like that. What's actually happening in our brain in the reward system? And using all of this knowledge to try and come up with interventions. So I've developed smartphone applications and virtual reality programs, etc., that try and help people overcome some of these biases. And more recently at CSIRO, I have also been working in the brain health and nutrition space. So some of my research is, I guess, a little bit of the opposite, and then I've looked at the effect of the different foods that we consume, different nutrients, supplements, etc., and how they actually shape our brain structure and function and our cognitive performance, but our mood as well. We know that food plays a really important role in not just how our brain works, but how we feel on a daily basis. So again, looking at interventions in this space. But more recently, I've shifted my attention back, I guess, toward this idea of using psychology to help promote health behavior change. How can we focus on, I guess, not just telling people what they need to do, but how they can actually do it as well?
Awesome. I mean, I've got a couple of pre-written, pre-drafted questions, but now I just want to go off in a million other directions based on some of that. But well, what I thought before we kick off into the health behaviors, and because I think you're spot on, like I'm thinking of a PhD student that I work with, that Ellie, who's focusing a lot on wellbeing literacy, and there's this key paper that she's always citing, which is basically someone, actually Tony Jorm, who's been on the show, making this critique that basically all mental health literacy programs are based on the assumption that knowledge equals behavior change.
Mm-hmm.
And that's, I mean, my assumption would be that's almost never the case. Is that like, would you sort of endorse that kind of position? We all know what's healthy and what's unhealthy, more or less.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, it's a good point in that we should always check with, I guess, the starting assumption. Do people have the knowledge or the literacy in a particular space? And certainly if people don't, then we do want to increase that literacy or knowledge.
Yep.
So that's at least there to start with. So we're not talking about replacing the need for knowledge, but more saying that it's not enough. People need to have some way of using that knowledge to be able to make a behavior change. It's not just simply a matter of, oh, you didn't know how many fruits and vegetables to eat, for example. So now that you know, you can go and do it. There's so much more to it than that. There's lots of psychological factors that go into it. There's lots of physical things as well. Won't want to go into it too much. cost of living. There's other barriers as well that come into it. So there's so many things to unpack. So we definitely can't assume that having the knowledge there is simply going to translate into behavior. And in fact, there was a recent sort of meta-analysis in this space around using different ways that we can help people change their behavior. And knowledge or education was actually sort of shown to be the least effective. Whereas something
Really?
like habit change, which I'll talk about later, is the most effective. So there's, I guess there's a lot to, again, it's not saying that we don't need the knowledge or the literacy, but we need to bundle that in with lots of other things to help people get to where they want to be. Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Awesome. And so please keep me on that narrow path because that's very, very valuable, I think, for people to be listening to. So before we jump into the sort of the resolutions and the health behaviors, I didn't realize that you'd worked with Craig Hassed from who's previously another guest on the show. So I was really surprised when I was looking at you Google Scholar there, how the worlds collide.
Yes, exactly. Small world, isn't it? And yes, I have heard your conversation with Craig. Was it a couple of years ago now? But yeah, I worked with Craig through. This is when I was working at
At
Monash
Monash, yeah.
University in Melbourne. Yeah, so it would have been just over 5 years ago now, and we collaborated along with other colleagues. So endocrinologist Kevin Lee that we both worked with as well, and this was around looking at mindfulness-based programs that were embedded into the curriculum for medical students. And it was looking at whether these sorts of programs could help, I guess, not necessarily just even reduce stress, but manage it. So we know that as medical students go on, their stress levels tend to increase, particularly as you're getting to exam periods, and there's lots of periods of really high pressure for medical students. So even seeing whether it could help mitigate these generally huge increases that we see in stress for these students at these times. And they had already, Craig and Kevin had already collected the data from this program that had run over a few weeks, quite a few weeks, and embedded into the curriculum. But I helped, I guess, offer another psychological perspective in this and looking at some of the changes in stress and burnout and things like that. And we actually did see some really promising effects in terms of not just the formal mindfulness practice, but the informal as well.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
formal might be that sort of prescribed level of mindfulness practice. But informal practice can also be just being more mindful in general in relation to different things as you go about your day. And I think Craig's spoken about that previously on the podcast. And I think it's really promising because we don't all have time to be undergoing formal programs or maybe necessarily carving out lengthy periods of time for practice, even though that we know that that's useful. But if we can even start to build in some of this informal practice, generally being more mindful. So when you're just doing something that's part of your daily activities, doesn't even necessarily have to be about the specific thing that you want to be more mindful about. It could be when you're going for a walk, being more mindful when you're driving, doing the dishes, etc. So just being more aware of what you're doing in the present moment, because we tend to be quite distracted in this day and age and sort of living life on autopilot. And it's something that I guess I have used in my current research in some ways, and I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but the idea of mindfulness can be really helpful when it comes to eating behavior, and particularly things like comfort or emotional eating. So that's something that I have continued to look at in sort of that specific instance. So yeah, really great to see the work that Craig's continuing to do in
Yeah.
that space more broadly as well.
Yeah. All right. Very cool. All righty. I looked it up, but I mean, I guess you probably could have guessed. The top 5 most common New Year's Eve resolutions were to eat healthier, to exercise more, to drink less, to manage stress, and to quit smoking. So I can imagine you probably wanting to tear your hair out a little bit, thinking like, we have the answers to all of these things, but but it's just not translated out. Like there are scientific ways that we can help people to build these in their life, but yet people rarely meet the goals that they set for themselves. So Talk to me about your thoughts generally on New Year's resolutions, particularly around probably ways that we can improve them.
Mm, yeah, look, I find them really fascinating actually, I guess because so many people experience this idea of setting a goal or a New Year's resolution. And we do see varied results, but for the most part, people tend to, well, I don't really like to use the word failure, but don't tend to stick with their New Year's resolutions for
Hmm.
very long. And, I guess that might be somewhat surprising because these are all things that are geared toward trying to make us a better person, or I guess in relation to some of the New Year's resolutions you mentioned are the top ones, a healthier version of
Yeah.
our current selves. But we know it's really, really difficult to achieve these New Year's resolutions. And I guess there's a few reasons why, and then there are actually a few relatively simple tips or tricks for helping improve not only the ability to achieve them, but I guess help to improve the resolution itself, which is going to make people more likely to be successful. So we know that, yes, it's January 2nd. Maybe some people have already given up on their New Year's resolution, or maybe you've got a few more weeks up your sleeve before it starts to become a little bit unstuck. But we know that most people really only stick with their resolution for a few weeks at the most, or at least until the end of January.
Hmm.
So why is that the case? Well, I guess, first of all, do we just simply no longer want to achieve our resolution? We don't want to achieve it, it's not important to us. Okay, that might be one reason, but what we tend to find is the answer is often no. People do still want to achieve that resolution. They haven't given up on that idea, their sort of ideal self, but they've given up on their, I guess, ability or belief to be able to sort of reach that place.
Hmm.
So we still want to become the best version and improve ourselves after the end of January. I think the main issue is that we just really don't consider how we will actually reach that resolution or that goal that we've set for ourselves. And I guess we have this idea that something has drastically changed about ourselves from, 11:59 the previous year to
Two
to
minutes
12 or
later.
2 minutes later exactly. There's something there's something drastic that's different that's going to mean that we can now achieve something that we hadn't previously. Um, and there's a couple of things that are sort of behind this. One is that our motivation is highest at this time. So one of the reasons is that we've really probably overindulged in some of these things. If we're talking about eating healthier or drinking less, we've probably just had a period of really perhaps overdoing it in terms of not eating as healthy as we usually would, drinking more than usual during the festive season. So we might even actually be starting to feel some of the negative consequences from those
Hmm.
things that we might not normally, just going about our daily lives where it's a little bit elevated. We're not eating quite as healthy, or we're just drinking that little bit more. But when we actually have, sort of really overdone it, particularly over maybe the whole of December, even the whole of the festive season, we might even just be starting to feel a little bit more sluggish, or we're not thinking as clearly. There could be, something around weight loss, or we've had lots of hangovers and things like that. So we might actually just not be feeling the best version of ourselves. So
Hmm.
that could be really motivating to try and reduce some of those sort of negative feelings. But it's also partly due to what's called the fresh start effect. So it's essentially behavioral science concept or phenomenon that was started by researchers, Day and colleagues from the University of Pennsylvania. And it's this idea that individuals are more likely to have this boost in motivation and therefore then engage in behaviours or activities that are really sort of geared toward achieving their personal goals. Can be health goals, could be other goals as well, maybe around finance or sort of more general self-improvement. And this happens at the start of a new time period or cycle. So it's due to the idea that we associate the start of a new time period or cycle with new beginnings. So this idea of a clean slate, and that you're actually sort of leaving behind, again, don't want to use the word failure so much, but maybe you've had setbacks, challenges, shortcomings, issues with achieving something before. Particularly in a health journey, we see that there's lots of challenges that come up along the way, that might sort of set you back. And really this new year represents starting anew or afresh. So
Yeah.
it's something that we call sort of a temporal landmark, and people can use it to try and organize their lives. So,
Hmm.
time's just marching on in this sort of linear way. And there's obviously certain things that we use to try and organize. We have seasons and we have months, etc. But a year is a really sort of, important time landmark that we use to help shape our lives. And it's really it's socially constructed, obviously. It's a socially constructed calendar event, but it's such a popular time to start afresh that it's really even coined its own phrase, which,
Yeah.
behavioral scientists, psychologists love to come up with really innovative things. It's called the New Year's effect. So it's such a strong embodiment of this sort of fresh start effect. But it's not just limited to this time period. So it can be other time periods. So, for example, if anyone's talked about starting a new diet or something like that, we often think about starting on a Monday. So it's this idea that you'll start again with the start of a new week. It could also be something that's personally meaningful. So sometimes we have goals that are tied to things like our birthday or a holiday or something like that. So something significant to us where we use
Hmm.
that as sort of the start of a new period. Even maybe a major life event. So moving to a new city, starting a new job. Sometimes these things sort of also coincide
Yeah.
with the start of a year.
And
Yeah.
no, I was going to say, are you saying that like it is a good way to sort of like hack a little bit of motivation, but is it ultimately enough motivation to keep you going, or where does the problem lie?
Yeah, so I guess the problem then lies in the fact that we do have this real boost of motivation, optimism, self-efficacy, or our belief in our own ability to be able to do something. And that boosts our commitment to achieving these goals. And we feel like we can be, I guess, we're more capable of achieving them
Hmm.
due to this boosted motivation. But there's, I guess, a few issues or things that can get in the way here. One of them is that it tends to lead us to setting more ambitious goals. So we might set a particularly lofty goal because we're feeling so motivated and feeling
Okay.
like we can really achieve it, rather than
That
setting
sounds
something that's
so
more,
familiar. My goodness. People must
yeah,
resonate with that. Yeah, yeah.
yeah. So setting something like, so I think a common one, for example, might be when it comes to exercise or physical activity and the start of the year, people might set a goal around, I don't know, running a half marathon or even running 10K or something like that. So something that's really ambitious, or setting a really high weight loss target. And it may be that, with exercise, for example, if you might not even be currently exercising. So it could be something really, really ambitious where it's not to say that you can't get there. You certainly could, but it's it might be a little bit unrealistic, because to get there would require so much training, etc. A completely different level of sort of physical activity and fitness level than where you're currently at. Whereas something like saying, I want to be able to walk for 30 minutes around the block, or even for 10 minutes, doesn't sound like a particularly impressive goal to have. But actually, if your goal is something a bit more general around becoming more physically active, thinking about what you could realistically do on a daily basis is going to help you get there. And we'll talk more about habits in a minute. But yeah, it's really this idea, I guess, that the goals that we set because of this boost in motivation are too ambitious, too unrealistic, that it makes it so much less attainable. So one of the really critical things is actually setting a better New Year's resolution. So thinking about, you can maybe start with that lofty, ambitious goal, and go with the idea of it. So something around that particular health behavior, but then think about almost a sub goal or a smaller goal within that, that's something that you could actually achieve. And, it doesn't have to be what do you want to achieve by the end of the year. It could be by the end of this month, I want to be
Yeah.
able to, walk for 30 minutes every day or something like that. So trying to make it more realistic. I guess the other thing that gets in the way though is that our motivation is not dependable. It's not reliable. So when we have this fresh start effect and it really boosts our motivation because of this change and this idea that we can almost, I guess, distance ourselves from
Hmm.
our past self. We have this idea that we have our our current self, our past self, our future self. We might have an idea with a fresh start effect that current self is much closer to that future self of who's achieved that goal than it is to that past self back last year, 1 day ago, who wasn't doing any of these things. But because of the time change, we have this idea that we're closer actually to that future self than the past,
Yeah.
which, we might be linking with, we're thinking of failures, etc. Oh no, that's not us anymore. Really, you're much closer to that than than you are to, you in 6 months' time.
Yeah.
But it's much nicer to be focusing on the future, something positive that you've achieved. But we need to be realistic and think about where we are right now and what can we actually do to get there.
Mm.
This
Do you
idea, sorry?
no, maybe this is like a completely stupid thing, but it's just what's in my head.
No,
It's
no.
like it's almost like people assuming. It's almost like assuming we're like a snake or something that can just like new skin, just completely like lose the whole skin in one hit, and I'm a brand new snake or whatever. I'm a brand new person. Like that was the old me. Off I slither. But that's just not how we work, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I mean, sometimes people almost have that as well when they've gone through a major life um, overhaul. They've recovered from an illness or maybe some sort of addiction or substance related issue that they're going through. People almost think of themselves as this, yeah, they've shed a skin, a completely different person. But the reality is that we're this series of interconnected selves. There's all of these links. It's not something completely different. So
Yeah.
you're right. And certainly there's nothing objective about the start of a new calendar year. You might be physically turning over a new page in the calendar or actually at the start of a year putting a new one up, but nothing's actually changed about yourself. But people have this idea that it's almost like that. You've, shed an old skin or something like that, and that they're completely different. So they will just be able to automatically achieve
Mm.
this new goal. But you've got to think about what you can actually do on a practical basis. And yeah, the motivation alone isn't going to
Yeah.
get you
And
there.
just a few sort of side distractions. I know I said I wouldn't get distracted, but
That's
it's,
okay.
it's life. If so, I've heard people say, I was motivated, so I had the fresh motivation of the new start, but then my motivation ran out, so I guess I probably just didn't care about it that much. Like,
Mm.
they're almost assuming that if you value it, you'll be motivated forever. Do you have any comments on that? Is that true?
No, not at all. Our
Good.
behaviors aren't, yeah, no, our behaviors aren't just driven by our feelings or desires or something that we really want to do. I think a good example is probably even something as simple as making a cup of coffee in the morning. People have this idea that we're driven to do that because we feel tired and we have a desire we haven't slept properly and we have a desire to reduce, the feelings of tiredness and feel more energized or alert. In reality, we have set up a habit, an automatic pattern of behavior that when we get up, we go and we might do something else first, I don't know, but we might go and then turn the coffee machine on, almost on autopilot. So sometimes being on autopilot is a good thing. And, and make our cup of coffee. We're not having to think about, should I go and do that? Should I not? What if I want to do something else? No, it just happens. And actually, we're probably thinking about a whole host of other things like what we want to do in the day, etc., and where we might be off to next or conversation that we've had with
Yeah.
someone. So our behaviors are really largely driven by habits rather than our specific desires or wishes or needs at that time. And so I think that's where people do get caught in a little bit of a trap with motivation. They think that, well, if I really wanted to do it, I would do it. So I mustn't want
Yes.
to. But with the New Year's resolutions, I guess this is what I was saying earlier. It's not the fact that you haven't achieved it, but you've not stuck with it by the 2nd of January, or even the end of January, doesn't almost all of the time. The goal hasn't changed. Your desire to become that better person of yourself, to eat
Hmm.
healthier, exercise more, drink less, that hasn't actually changed. But we equate not doing the behaviors with the idea that that must have disappeared. We didn't really want it, so that's why we didn't do it. No, it's because our motivation fluctuates so much, and that's why we can't rely on it as a key driver of our
Yeah.
behavior. So it fluctuates across the year and with different seasons, and we see seasonal general fluctuations in motivation. So we tend to see some dips when it comes to winter, for example. Certainly it's really high at the start of the year, and you can actually track that against things like attending a gym. It basically sort of follows that real peak and then drops off. It changes at a really broad level and sort of for many individuals, but it also changes within ourselves as well. Across the day, we see dips in motivation. If you think about it, for example, most people will perform relatively healthy behaviors or habits in the morning. So we might start by waking up on time, brushing our teeth, having breakfast. As we go through the day and we start to feel more stressed, different things have come up for us, just part of our normal lives,
Hmm.
kids, work, managing different household things. We start to see a bit of a dip in motivation. So that's why some people, for example, say they have to get their exercise done first thing in
Yeah.
the morning. So it fluctuates across the day. And I mean, researchers like Baumas is a really well-known self-control researcher. This idea of sort of ego depletion. So if we become depleted and we don't have as much physical energy, mental energy, we become stressed, mood's not so great. These things can really interfere with our motivation or our self-control, our ability to sort of, I guess, behave in line with our goals. But this is why we really need, I guess, formal structures or systems in place to ensure consistency.
Hmm.
And this is where we can think about habits as being really key. And this is what we want to build, I guess. If we want to use that New Year's motivation, we want to build habits, not relying on the
Mm.
resolutions or the goals.
So I'm wondering, I'm again going off the script a little bit here, but if we were, what's a good way forward? Like if we were to say like, maybe we use a working example of what someone's resolution might be, and then we can kind of pick it apart in terms of how is that kind of conflicting with, a good habit,
Hmm.
something like that. Like if we just think like, what would be a like a standard news resolution of like, I want to lose weight, let's just say, you know,
Mm.
like
Hmm.
someone says, I want to lose 10 kilos, let's say. And then I guess the next question is, how are you going to do that?
Yeah.
Maybe that person hasn't thought about this in any way. So is that part of it, is defining exactly what you're going to do?
Yes, exactly. It's thinking about, I guess, firstly, recognizing some of these things that you might be really motivated to do this right now, but that's going to dip, and that's your end goal. That's what you want to achieve.
Hmm.
But as well as setting the goal or the resolution, which is what you want to achieve, you also need to set what we call, I guess, the tangible aspect of that. So it's how are you going to achieve it? So
Hmm.
how will you, if you really focus on weight as a particular goal, which even though might not be ideal, we know that that's something really common, and people do like something that's, I guess, quite specific and measurable in that
Hmm.
ways, and you can
Hmm.
see if you've achieved it or not. So lots of people do use that, but it's that next second step then of not just what is your resolution or your goal, but how will you achieve that? And breaking it down into what's something that you could do every day that would get you there. So what's a habit, a new habit that you could start? And then setting up a system in place to help you do that. If you said that you wanted to, so how you were going to
Or
lose
maybe
10 kilos?
let's just say
Yeah.
let's go do something like let's just say maybe like I want to read more. Let's go with something that's a little bit more, because once you get into dietary recommend, that's a whole thing. So if we
There's
just go,
lots
all
of
right,
things that go into that. Yeah.
I want to read more. Let's say
Okay.
2025, new year, new me. I'm reading all these books. So that's
Well,
that's kind of the
yep.
outcome. Now you're saying set some habits, some clarifications on the how
Yep.
will you do that?
Yep. And I like this one because that was my New Year's resolution last year.
Okay.
So it's a nice one as well because it's more around that, maybe stress management, something to do for enjoyment or something other than, like you say, just around diet, which lots of people will set things like that, but something a little bit different. Okay, so essentially, if you want to set up a habit around reading, or you might have even said, I want to read 12 books a year or something, a book a month. How are you actually going to do that? And I guess there's lots of things that we can think about here, but there's a few tips and tricks. So thinking about making it really specific. So what are you going to do each day? A book just doesn't just get read by itself. What are you actually going to do each day? In my case, I set myself a really specific target of reading for 5 minutes every night before I went to bed. And I also tried to swap it out for something else that I was already doing because people might already go, I don't have more time in my day than
Mm-hmm.
I did last year. I imagine quite a few of us would spend at least 5 minutes browsing on social media. Could we, and it's not saying to completely go without that, but could we even just swap 5 minutes of that time for reading a book? So thinking about, I guess, trying to replace it with something else. So swapping in one habit for another. So swapping in a healthier habit for another, and that can try to overcome some of the barriers around, I guess, time, which we know is a time and energy, which we know is a barrier for lots of people. If you're thinking about adding something else to your life, it can already seem like it's going to be too much. For me, it also would, I guess, have the added bonus of it might even be something that would help me get to sleep or perhaps feel a
Mm-hmm.
bit more relaxed. When we think about building habits, we're thinking about the cue. So what is it in our environment that might trigger us to do a particular behavior? And we're thinking about the response and the reward. So if you're thinking about reading, if you want to read before bed, for example, when you get into bed, we'll keep the book next to on your bedside table. When you get into bed, putting your phone away, maybe even putting it in another room, but at least
So
putting it in a drawer or something. Exactly. It's reducing the friction. And I know we're talking about reading, but that's something people talk a lot about with diet as well. If you said I wanted to eat healthier and your pantry was stocked with biscuits and chips and things like that, you're essentially just creating friction for yourself. You're creating a self-control dilemma every day. So if you can try and remove the cues that would previously
Mm-hmm.
trigger you to do a behavior that you're sort of less interested in doing now. So for me, it would have been, scrolling on social media. Okay, so can your phone go away? Have the book there ready to go. So you've replaced the cue with something else and you've put it maybe in the exact same spot that the old cue would have been in. So your book's where your phone is, and the other part of this is the goal. So 5 minutes, or it might be, 5 pages or something like that. You could make it even less. You could do a page or a minute. Something that's so achievable in terms of mentally thinking about committing to that. Okay, everyone's got, 1 extra minute in the day,
Mm-hmm.
but also so achievable that you can do it and then you get that sense of achievement. Because when it comes to setting habits, the last thing you want to do is to do something that you can't achieve, maybe even on the first time of doing it. It'd be the same with, saying I'm going to go for a 10K run and you're not used to doing it. You might get 1K in and go, oh, I'm done. All right, it's January 2nd. I've given up because I tried it that first time and it didn't work. Whereas something like saying I'm going to walk for 5 minutes around the block, something that's just really, really small. And this comes back to this idea of this sort of, tiny habits concept.
Yeah.
Something that you can do so it's feasible, it's practical, so you can do it, but then it gives you that sense of achievement, it boosts your motivation. And what we often find happens is that people exceed it. So they actually not just meet it, which gives them the boost, but they then exceed it as well. So you say, I'm going to read for 5 minutes, all of a sudden, you've read 3 chapters and not even really thought about it. So it gives people the boost that they need versus that really lofty thing that they're not likely to be able to achieve. But the other thing is, even if you stick with the 5 minutes, it's something that you can realistically fit in each day. And the key with building habits is consistency. So you want to form that repetition so that you don't have to think about it. It becomes like making a cup of coffee or brushing your teeth. It's automatic. You're on autopilot. You do it without having to make a conscious decision, because our goals are these conscious things that require a lot of effort to think about. Habits are automatic. They're there for a reason. They're mental shortcuts. They save us time, mental energy by doing things without having to use up our sort of cognitive resources. So they're really effective and efficient for that reason. And they're not a bad thing. We think about often bad habits, but the exact same mechanisms are used to set up good habits. It's just being conscious of what our habits are, and the fact that once you fall into a habit, it's also really hard to get out of it. You can, but it's hard to break it. But use that to your advantage if you're trying to set up something that's a good thing. There's other things you can do as well. So habit stacking. So habit stacking is adding on a good habit to something that you already do that's a positive, not something that you're trying to change or break. Really good example of that is something like flossing your teeth. If you brush your teeth every night, you're in the same place, same time, etc. Add in flossing straight after, straight before, so that you've bundled those two things together. So it almost becomes sort of one thing. So reading could become the same. And you might even sort of be able to bundle that with, as soon as I've brushed my teeth and got into bed, then every night I'll, read for 5 minutes, for example. Bundling things together to make it, less. Again, reducing the friction, having less things to think about. Although when I say bundling, it can actually also be bundling a sort of, I guess, a more enjoyable, pleasurable thing that you already do with a less fun thing. And that can be something like if you're trying to exercise more. So you might prefer to sit down and watch your favorite show on Netflix. I'm sure lots of us are spending time binge watching shows on Netflix at the moment. Not saying to stop that, but you might say that you can watch your favorite show every time you get on your exercise bike at home. And you're pedaling away. That's when you can watch your favorite show. So you're still doing those things, but it actually makes the thing that you don't like as much, which is obviously the cycling, more enjoyable. And you start to associate it with a positive thing and something you might even look forward to. Or going for a walk around the block, that's when you can listen to your favorite podcast. So again, I guess all these things are really just trying to make your life easier. Don't make it hard to make new habits, and they actually are really easy to form once you think about some of these simple barriers that you can remove, or some things that can make it easier. I mean, think about something like brushing your teeth, right? It's a really good example of an automatic behavior, not just because it's something that everyone does, but because it's such a good example of something that you will do regardless of your motivation levels. So you can have had a really stressful day. You can be really tired. Maybe you didn't sleep well the night before and things have gone wrong at work and everything's sort of, happened that day. you're still very, very likely to brush your teeth before bed. It's very unlikely that it would be so extreme that that's the thing that's completely dropped off. So it doesn't fluctuate based on your motivation or your mood or your stress. If we can try and create other things that are that strong,
Automatic,
robust in
yeah.
our routine, then that's really going to help in
Yeah.
working toward achieving our New Year's resolutions.
I like it. I like that. I think just as a phrase, self-control dilemma just sounds so good. And it is, it is that thing of like, actually, I think Craig mentioned on the episode with him, which was like just having your phone on your desk, even if it's face down,
Hmm.
like that interrupts your performance, just that enough, which I think is amazing. Like this, it's almost like, maybe in a perfect world, I could be whatever mentally strong enough to like not be distracted by my phone, but I am who I am. I have to accept that, and so it's actually more productive for me just to get rid of the phone altogether while I'm trying to form this habit. Is that, would you endorse that kind of way of thinking, like you said about the biscuits in the pantry sort of thing?
Yes. Yeah, exactly. I guess the best way to overcome a self-control dilemma is to not have it in the first place.
Okay.
People that don't struggle with, I guess, so-called self-control conflicts are people that don't expose themselves to that. So it's not about necessarily constantly using all of your willpower up to resist all of these tempting things. You're not faced with it. So it's, not keeping the biscuits, or at least not
Hmm.
keeping them right out on eye level, somewhere that you have to walk past
Yeah.
every time you get up from your desk. Or it's not keeping your phone, next to your computer when, you've set yourself a goal of writing so many words per day, or doing something with work, or even just, generally concentrating. It's removing those cues from the environment that don't help you reach your goals, because at the end of the day, it's not even about saying that you don't have good willpower if you can't sort of resist them. It's really about the idea as well that with it can be foods. They've been designed in such a way, particularly with ultra processed foods. I don't want to get into it too much, but they've been certain formulations. You don't sort of find yourself going past a bowl of fruit going, really just, can't resist one more. But it's these ultra processed foods that have certain combinations of nutrients or lack of nutrients in them that,
Being used
people
against
find
you.
really, people find them really palatable. And there's not many foods in nature that you would find with these certain compositions of fat and salt and sugar, etc. Or your phone, great example. Our phones are designed to draw us in. They're, with all the notifications and how social media works, etc., it's around the idea of reward and intermittent reward. And it's all been designed, it's based on psychology and neuroscience. It's based on evidence that, we've created of how our brains work, but you can use that information in lots of different ways. And that's how,
Yeah.
that's been built
Yeah.
into these platforms. So we can't blame ourselves for that. Our brains are wired in particular ways and we'll respond to them, but you can remove things from the situation.
Yeah, okay. I guess when I was sort of saying about, like in a perfect world, I could just overcome my, my phone addiction or something. But it's like it's the phone is actually not neutral, is what I'm hearing
Hmm.
from you, and
Hmm.
the snacks are not neutral because they've actually been used. They've been designed to be addictive, like like the foods that you're mentioning. So it's kind of not like it's like not a passive thing or something. So it's like I don't know. I'm almost feeling like it's a war against the people who are trying to addict you on these various not the people. I mean, I guess it's not really like that kind of thing, but it's a war for your attention and for your yeah. I don't know, willpower. You said you wouldn't call it willpower?
Well, I mean, that can be a component of it, and particularly now as we are busier and more stressed, and people do have so many more things competing for your attention. I guess it's the idea that, well, willpower's a whole thing in and of itself, because I sort of break it down, and this is what's been talked about in the research as well. your will, so sort of your motivation to make a change, but your power or your capacity, your ability to
Hmm.
actually be able to make that change as well. And those two things come together. So you need to be motivated or have a desire to do something different, whether it's using your phone less and reading more, swapping out a healthier for an unhealthy food option. But you need to have the ability or the capacity to do it as well. And sometimes that's sort of a physical element, and sometimes it's, your mental capacity. And if it gets to the end of the day, that might be drastically reduced. Or if you've got
Hmm.
lots of
Hmm.
distractions that, going on in your life, that might be something that's meaning you're more likely to go for some comfort food, or that you want to check your phone more and things like that, or to get that sense of reward from sort of checking notifications. I guess maybe coming back to some of Craig's work though in the mindfulness space, it's not so much about, because realistically we will be faced with these foods, we'll be faced with phones, we'll be faced with, Netflix instead of going for a walk, etc. These things will continue to be in our environment to a certain extent, even if we try to minimize or, remove them at certain times, etc. In general, we will still be faced with these things.
Hmm.
And so the idea again of completely giving all of these things up or going without might again be that sort of unrealistic goal.
Yeah.
And we
Yeah.
might find ourselves not meeting it and then completely, again, another really inventive psychological phrase, the so what effect. So you've sort of, you've given into something and then you give up because, oh, well, I had one day where I didn't go and exercise. Oh, well, I've eaten one block of chocolate, so I may as well give up now. Versus recognizing that it's kind of a setback and we're all going to have these slip ups from
Yeah.
time to time.
Yeah.
But apart from that, yeah, so not thinking about getting rid of all of these things completely, because it's perhaps not a reality in the current world that we live in. But coming back to some of Craig's ideas around being more mindful. So I think one of the issues can be that we may not even realize that when we're sitting at our desk trying to work, that we're reaching for our phone and that we're checking our messages or our social media notifications.
Hmm.
So by being more mindful, whether it's about that specific activity or in general, we can just become more aware. And so, yes, we might check it, but if we have better levels of mindfulness, attentiveness, and we can recognize what we're doing in the present moment, and we have that ability to go, hang on, I have just checked my phone. All right, but I want to get back and do what I wanted to do. Or,
Hmm.
um, oh yeah, I have just reached for the biscuits and I've had a couple. Yeah, I'm probably not actually that hungry. I might just pop them away and, later on go for something else that's a little bit more aligned with
Hmm. Hmm.
my health or health goals, etc. So I think that's where something like mindfulness and realizing the distractions, the temptations that we're all going to inevitably face can be really helpful frame of mind to try and get ourselves in, so that it's not, and that can help us with sort of this, I guess, potential battle of willpower as well, is actually just being more mindful of what is in the environment rather
Yeah.
than
Yeah.
doing it, then not, eventually realizing, but maybe after a prolonged period of time, feeling really guilty, needing to do something else that relieves that feeling of guilt. And that's where we sort of get into that bit of a cycle with emotional comfort eating sometimes.
Yeah, yeah. I want to get into that because I can imagine that some of this stuff with comfort, even comfort eating, applies to just comfort in general. Like I think so many, as a modern people, I think we're pretty addicted to comfort and we step away from uncomfortableness,
Hmm.
which probably a lot of this, it's quite uncomfortable probably to start some of these habits, like to feel a bit hungrier, to be physically more tired from exercise. These do feel uncomfortable. I just wanted to ask, like, how much do you focus on, or how much should someone focus on, like, almost like the practicalities of their habit? Like, for example, if you're talking about the habit of making a coffee in the morning, like, you sort of automatically make sure that you have, you know, coffee beans at
Mm.
home. You make sure that the things that you need are there for you. that means when you're at the shop, you have it on your shopping list or whatever, like being very methodical or something about what does it actually take for me to achieve this goal.
Yeah, definitely. We can't expect to achieve these things, particularly around some of these health goals that do involve, maybe practically needing to have a pair of running shoes or healthier options for snacks or a book to read.
Mm-hmm.
We do need to think about all of these things and setting ourselves up. I guess some of that requires planning and preparation. We know that that is really important when it comes to setting up healthy habits. And so, for example, I mentioned the examples of the book earlier, knowing how you can get that, putting it somewhere that's going to be obvious. For exercise, it might be having some of those cues that visually remind you to engage. So it might be that your shoes, you keep them out by the front door, or maybe you keep them by couch because it's a bit of a reminder when you go to sit down that,
Yeah.
oh, that's right, I had thought of going for it. But it's whatever's going to work for you in terms of a habit. I mean, some people say that when they're first starting out, they want to go for a run first thing in the morning or something. They actually need to sleep in exercise clothes. So that, again, that's reducing the friction. There's not an
Yeah.
extra step to
Yeah.
have to do. So it's setting up some of these things or thinking about what foods you might be able to keep out or um, buy at the shops, for example, and making some plans around that. So there's certainly lots of practical elements that need to be considered because, like you said, you can have an automatic habit of making a coffee, but if there's no coffee beans, it's not going to happen. But I guess there's the practical, and then coming back to the psychological, there's actually knowing what your habits are as well. And so when we think about making a new habit that aligns with a New Year's resolution, for example, you might even want to think about, well, some of these examples. So we all have habits already. What are the things, and particularly thinking about some of the good ones that we might have, what are the things that we already do that help maintain those for us? Or how did we might think about how we set them up initially, but what makes it so that we can do these things automatically every day? Think about, and then thinking about some examples of good habits you have also helps as well, right? With sort of boosting your, I guess maybe motivation or bit of self-confidence of, yeah, I actually do quite a few good things already. I am the sort
Mm-hmm.
of person that can, that's that sort of positive sense of self-identity. I'm the sort of person that can have good habits. Yeah, I might have developed some that I'm not so happy with, but I also do all of these really great things that are helpful for my health. So
Yeah.
how can I learn from those?
Yeah.
What do I
Yeah.
do to maybe have a, coffee bean subscription that comes every month or something like that? There could just be something that you've set up which makes it really, really
Just
easy.
make it easy for yourself. Yeah, I like that idea of sort of self-examination because and
Yeah.
maybe it's helpful with having an outside observer. I don't know whether that counts in this world or not, but I can think of times where, say, my wife, like if I say, yeah, I want to go for a run tonight or something, and then I say, I'll just sit on the couch and then in like 10 minutes I'll go. And she would say, do you ever notice that you sit on the couch and then you don't get back up? Like that's just kind of how it goes every time. So why do you expect it to be any different? That almost sounds like what you were saying about the examination of what are your current habits and are they productive? Are they effective for the goals that you're setting for yourself?
Yeah, exactly. Part of your sort of habit stock take, you might be able to rely on yourself, but it can be really helpful to chat with someone else. I think there's a difference between telling everyone you meet about your New Year's resolution and posting all these things about it, because sometimes people tend to overdo that a little bit
Okay.
too
Yeah.
much
Gotcha.
versus that accountability of a trusted friend, partner, family member, etc., who can help you. It's not just about telling them what your goal is, but exactly as you said, they can help you to figure out maybe what it is you're already doing that's really helpful
Hmm.
for your health or creating your habits, or they might also notice some of those things that are less helpful that, without hopefully they're doing it in a supportive constructive way, and not saying you
Sure.
always do this or you always that, but trying to help you identify it, because as you said, our habits are automatic, whether
Yeah.
positive or negative. We're not always aware of them. And so it can actually be really hard to sort of bring them to our awareness. Whereas someone else observing is much more likely to notice actually
Hmm.
what you're doing. So that can be a really, really helpful method, because one of the first steps to changing habits is to identify what you want to do or what you're already doing, and having someone else there who can help you identify those things, but then provide that ongoing support as well. We all know that having social support when we're trying to achieve a goal is going to be a lot easier. Having someone that we're accountable, and we see that a lot as well with when people start out, they want to start getting up and going for a run or going to the gym or something
Hmm.
like that, finding a person to go with who they're turning up to. I guess the key is that you don't want to become reliant on them. If they decide that, it's not for them, well, I'm not
Yeah.
going to do it
Yeah,
anymore
that's a
either.
really good point.
But it can be a really good
Okay.
start.
And is there a place that you would recommend people go who want to set habits? Like, is there a sort of a list? I know people talk about, say, SMART goals and things like that, but
Hmm.
these things, like what you're saying, like a habit stock take, that's again such a good phrase. A habit stock take, something to do with maybe examination on what you are. Is there like a place
Yeah.
or like some resource that you send people to?
Well, there's lots and lots of habit trackers available now. They're fairly variable, I guess, in terms of how much detail they go into, but it's something that can essentially help people track what it is they're doing on a daily basis. So there's online versions of these tools, there's apps. Sometimes people use paper-based trackers. Sometimes people just even keep notes in their phone or something like that. And it's essentially tracking maybe what habit you're already doing, or when you're making a new habit, what you're doing, where you are, time of day. Are there other things going on in terms of doing it with someone, doing it with someone else, for example? And you actually track how often you're doing these things until it becomes habitual and you're not having to consciously think about it. But it can also be really useful for thinking about, oh, well, I didn't do it on that day, or I usually walk for 30 minutes. I only got 5 minutes in, which is still great. What happened? That was the day that, there may be something unexpected happen, or you might start to identify a pattern where every time you feel a bit stressed, you don't do whatever it
Yeah.
is. You don't do your reading, you don't do your exercise, or maybe it's something around drinking or eating something that you were trying not to. So you may start to notice sort of a pattern. So yes, there's lots of good tools out there that can help people sort of more formally keep track, using these habit trackers. And if it's helpful, I can send through. I think there's a couple of lists available online of some of the
Yeah, no, that'd be
top
great.
ones that people find useful. So
Yeah.
I guess it's sort of bringing the unconscious to the conscious mind by
Yes.
having a formal
Yeah.
way of tracking. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that a lot. So very cool. So can we circle back quickly to comfort eating? You were sort
Hmm.
of talking about that as, did you call it like a negative cycle, or what was the phrase you used?
Yeah, yeah. I guess comfort eating can sort of become a vicious cycle, despite
Vicious.
comfort sounding like a nice term. Comfort or emotional eating. So, again, this is something that so many people will very likely be able to identify with.
Hmm.
They've consciously thought of it before, or even probably as I describe it, and I go, oh, that's something that, something that I do. So it's really just this tendency to overeat in response to emotions, but specifically negative emotions. And this is the idea of comfort, in that if we're experiencing something negative, say we're feeling sad, bored, or more of a sort of situational thing like feeling stressed, we're seeking comfort. As you said earlier, we really don't like experiencing discomfort. So, yes, that could be physical discomfort of our first, run for 2025, but it could be just general, these negative emotions that come up for people on a regular basis. And although it's something that, yes, we might do it from time to time and maybe it's not too much of an issue, if it starts to become essentially one of the key cues or drivers of our tendency to perhaps overeat, or it could be something else that's, not so helpful, but it really has been strongly linked with eating, it might become a bit problematic. Firstly, from the perspective of people relying on it as the comfort strategy or the coping strategy, because it's not actually doing anything in the long term to help address any of these issues. It will temporarily likely relieve the negative emotion, partly by way of distraction, but typically some of the foods that we go for when we are comfort eating as well are foods that are these sort of hyper palatable foods that I mentioned earlier. So they might be high in salt, sugar, or fat, or a combination, and they tend to give us a little bit of a boost to our brain's reward system. So we may actually experience a sort of, I guess, heightened a positive state when we eat these foods. So these tend to be the foods that people go for, and there's associations that we learn there. So, but that's going to be temporary, and then particularly if we have overeaten, so eaten a little bit more than we usually would, or something that's quite hyperpalatable, we might actually then feel guilty even that we've eaten that food.
Yeah.
And so this is sort of what I
It's
mean
just
by a vicious
adding more,
cycle.
discomfort.
Yeah, exactly. So that's one part of the issue, I guess. The other reason can be that there can be then physical issues as well. So obviously, if you're repeating this over long periods of time, we also tend to see that higher levels of emotional eating are linked with things like weight gain, which can be linked with other negative health outcomes as well. So there's kind of a couple of issues with it, and that we're not actually addressing the underlying problem, and there can be it can make people feel worse in the long run, both physically and mentally. I think the tricky thing with comfort eating is actually figuring out whether we're doing it. So there are lots of different cues that drive our habitual responses, automatic responses, emotions being one of them. So they're sort of the main internal cue. There's lots of external things in our environment, but they're the main internal cue. So how we feel at a particular time. Actually recognizing, it's hard for people to recognize their emotions in the first place. People often don't know how they're feeling unless it's something really, maybe they can recognize some of the extremes, but lots of people struggle with identifying what exactly it is that they're feeling at a particular time. And then to notice that you're eating in response to that can be even more challenging. So it's actually something like habit tracking can be useful, but it might even start with mood tracking where you're noticing how you're feeling on different days. And then do you eat something in response to that? So I think the thing with changing really all of our habits is thinking about, trying to identify what it is that we're doing in the first place. With comfort eating, with all habits, I suppose the next step is thinking about, are we changing the cue that's driving the behavior? Or if we can't change the cue, do we change the response? So for example, if you come home and stressed and automatically go for a glass of wine, what are you changing there? Are you changing how stressed you feel, or are you changing what you do in response to that stress? It can be pretty difficult to change how we feel. And actually, we're all human. We all experience different emotions. They're not always going to be positive ones. We recently ran a study, and we found that about 75% of people overate or indulged in certain foods when they were feeling bored. So that was sort of the most common reason
Interesting.
for people. Yeah, linked to comfort eating, but sadness was closely followed. And we do tend to see that it's these emotions where it's sort of a low arousal. So it doesn't tend to be when people are feeling angry or, really fired up. It's sort of feeling bored or sad, although stress and anxiety is sort of comes into that as well. So recognizing what it is for you. Then thinking about, can you change that emotion? maybe you can. Maybe there's something that's causing you to feel that way and you can do something different to make yourself, you can feel less stress, or you can manage your stress in a different way. So example, you had a really, really high stress job. Of course, someone might eventually change their job or something like that. But it might just be, well, actually, this is sort of just something that is part of my normal life. There's probably not so much I can do to change how I'm feeling. And part of it is then accepting that you will feel discomfort sometimes. You're not always going to feel really happy. How can you change how you respond to it? And so an
Yeah.
example of cues in this space would be, if you keep your wine and your glasses in a particular cupboard, can you literally swap what's in that cupboard for cups of tea, or mugs and packets of herbal tea or something like that, so that you can go to the exact same place when you come home. You can go through the same sort of physical action of pouring yourself a drink, but it's swapping it out. But it has
Hmm.
to be something that gives you the same feeling of relaxation or comfort. So if tea's not
Yeah.
going to cut it and you think, I'm only going to feel less stressed if I get out and I go for a walk around the block. Great. It doesn't have to be the exact same thing. It's
Yeah.
whatever's actually
Yeah.
just going to give you the same outcome or reward.
Interesting. And so, yeah, so there's a lot of self-examination. I guess that's important there.
Mm.
And the last question I guess I was going to ask you was, well, you mentioned acceptance, and I think you said something earlier that made me think of acceptance, but it almost seems like it's been throughout the whole conversation so far, and
Hmm.
I'm conscious of the time. But how hard? Because you said earlier, like, say someone wants to start running marathons, but they can barely make it down the street. Like you sort of said, you have to be setting goals for where you are right now. Like I get the sense sometimes that that's quite hard for people to accept,
Mm.
maybe in the context, say, of like aging or recovering from an injury, that maybe I'm not where I was. How hard is acceptance when it comes to this? Even that idea of like, all right, I accept that I drink wine to relax at the end of the night, and maybe I don't want to do that anymore. Because part of my question is, I guess, going to this idea that you look up, you see articles and things on social media saying like, weight loss, it's not your fault. There's almost this judgmental framing that I'm kind of trying to contrast with an acceptance framing. Is that relevant in this conversation?
Yes, definitely. I think part of it is, well, probably the first part around thinking about if you're recovering from a injury or illness or something about aging, there is a small link to the idea of self-identity that I spoke about earlier, in that, your current, your past, your future self, and there's, how connected are they? And that can be really dependent based on a lot of different things. So some of that might be an acceptance piece of, well, realistically, what are you going to be able to achieve given something that you've experienced, or the fact that you are aging, or something else has happened? So there may be a bit of a change of identity or self-concept there that is something to consider, I guess, when setting goals, so that you can still work towards something that's achievable. It might be about setting up a long-term, a medium-term, and a short-term goal,
Mm-hmm.
but still with the idea of what can you do every day to get to one of these goals. Just because you can't achieve, or you may not be able to immediately achieve running a marathon, there might be something else that you can do in the meantime, and you can think about sort of this series of steps. And life's continuously evolving as well. It's not like you just work toward achieving this one thing. So there might be this sort of series of linked goals that you can bring in, um, that may help you to accept that you're not quite where you want to be right now.
Yeah. Yeah.
But I think you've raised a really good point in that people do set goals around where they want to be without considering often where they're currently at. And where you're currently at will have a major role in, where you're going to be able to get to, at least how quickly you can get there. Not whether you ever
Mm-hmm.
get there, but how quickly you can get there.
Yeah.
The idea of personal responsibility, though, I guess, is a slightly different point, in that we are talking about individual behavior change and motivation and our capabilities and our goals and habits, etc. And we've touched on it a little bit, but we don't operate in isolation. Even thinking about the fact that you're setting these goals in the context of, you might live with other people, you might have
Yeah.
families, you've got certain social situations and factors that will come into play. And so how realistic is it for you right now to be thinking about, for example, running a marathon versus something that's a little bit more manageable based on current family situations, etc. And then the broader environment as well. And I mean, there's many layers in between there than who you just currently live with in the whole environment. But there's obviously lots of environmental factors at play. And we do need to consider that, yes, so we've spoken about there's certain types of foods that are more easily accessible and available to people that might be more affordable. It can be easier now to drive places, and
Hmm.
there's more entertainment options available. Our phones are accessible to us. There's lots of things in the broader environment that we are not competing with, but working with as part of our lives. And I guess the focus for some people might be on changing some of those things. And it's not to say that we can't do that or that one is better than the other. I think it all goes hand in hand. There's probably things about the broader environment that could be improved, or very most likely are things about the broader environment that could be improved to make, areas more walkable for
Hmm.
people, or
Hmm.
access to healthy food easier and more affordable for people. There's certainly some broad system level things at play that we need
Hmm.
to consider that can make it challenging for people currently to engage in, these healthy behaviors. At the same time, even if we had, the healthiest possible environment, we're still individuals, and you still need to help people, become more motivated, or to have the right systems in place for themselves, like these healthy habits that can help them interact with that environment
Hmm.
in
Hmm.
the best way possible. So it's probably a very, I guess, balanced answer, but I think it always comes down to a combination of trying to help the individual and trying to ensure that the environment surrounding that person is as supportive as possible.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, I guess that question sort of comes from an overcorrection maybe that I mentioned that
Mm,
I'd seen before. I'm sure you've seen it before, where like, yes, it was unfair that, back in previous years we might have said, weight loss, it's just up to you. If you're overweight, that's only as a result of your choices or something, like very much with that judgmental
mm.
mentality. And the pendulum has potentially swung too far to say that it's got nothing to do with the individual, and the answer, as always, is somewhere in between.
Yeah, and I do think that if we tell people as well, not just, I guess, environment, but even something like weight, that it's all up to genetics, if we tell people essentially that it's all outside of their control,
Hmm.
it can make people also feel helpless, or like there's nothing they can do, that they're trying really hard. There's nothing you can do anyway because, psychological term, this sort of locus of control. You don't want to think that everything is outside of your control, so everything's external, or that everything's internal and up to you. Neither of those is a particularly helpful way of thinking. What you really want is a balance, and knowing that some things might be outside of your control, but others are within it, and knowing which is which and how you can use that, I guess, to the best of your ability, and particularly when it comes to thinking about living a healthy life.
Yeah, awesome. All right, well, thank you so much for your time, Naomi. Sorry we went a little bit over. Anything else, anything you wanted to say that haven't had a chance to say, or
I guess just in thinking about New Year's resolutions, well, if you have already given up today, January 2nd, it's not too late. Why not make another one? We've still got the whole rest of the year ahead of us, but think about what it is for you that's achievable, manageable, and might be something that's, yeah, really helpful in your life. And just thinking about what it is, it's one thing that you could do every day that helps you work towards your goal. and try and enjoy that process of reaching it. It's not just about the outcome. It's even just doing that one little thing for yourself every day. And I know that's going to be my New Year's resolution this year, is to even just carve out a minute for myself every day. That's something around the idea of self-care that might provide that little boost of, yeah, motivation or happiness. So thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, no stress. And where can people find you? I think you're on LinkedIn.
Yes, on LinkedIn, I can include the link after, and I'm happy to provide any other links to resources as well around habit tracking and things like that that might be useful for getting people started and pursuing their health goals.
Beautiful. All right. Thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.